Power without a throne. Who governs when nobody appears to be in charge? You try to fix a simple problem, an account issue, a billing error, a delayed service, and you are passed from form to form until the only thing you can find is a policy that cannot be questioned. The person in front of you is not cruel, not careless, and often not empowered. They are a relay for a system that speaks in rules. So a horizon question opens: if nobody seems to be in charge, who is doing the governing? And what exactly is being governed? When decisions are distributed across tools, policies, and incentives, power does not disappear. It scales into the architecture of the system, and governance becomes whatever the system permits, constrains, and ignores. This sermon will examine power without visible rulers, how authority migrates into defaults, metrics, and infrastructure, how speed and capability create pressure against control, and how local optimization can destabilize the whole. It will not claim that any single actor secretly directs everything, and it will not offer a neat solution or a program to implement. It will stay with the reality that most modern governance is partial, contested, and shaped by uncertainty, and that the consequences of that uncertainty are not evenly distributed. To ask who governs, we need to name a few plain terms, because the absence of a visible ruler does not mean the absence of rule. First, power. In everyday speech, power sounds like force or command. In systems, power is the ability to reliably shape outcomes over time. A person may have power, so can a policy, a budget constraint, an interface design, a queue, a ranking, a contract, a set of categories on a form. If something consistently steers what happens next, it is exercising power. Second, governance. Governance is not only law and enforcement. Governance is the set of decision rights and constraints that determine how choices are made, how conflicts are resolved, and what happens when the system is stressed. A household has governance, a workplace has governance, a software platform has governance, a market has governance. Governance can be formal or informal, visible or hidden, deliberate or accidental. Third, authority. Authority is power that is recognized as legitimate within a given frame. This matters because many systems run on compliance more than coercion. People follow procedures because they believe they must, because they fear consequences, or because the alternatives are too costly. Authority can be attached to roles and titles, but it can also attach to paperwork, to technical expertise, to the way it's done, and to automated decisions that cannot be appealed. Fourth, distributed decision-making. This is a condition where no single node, no single person, team, or office has full knowledge or full control. Yet, decisions still happen through many small actions. The system behaves as if it has a mind, but the mind is an emergent property, a composite of partial incentives, partial information, and partial accountability. With these terms, we can locate the puzzle. When nobody appears to be in charge, governance often moves from explicit command into implicit design. It shows up as defaults that are hard to change, metrics that define success, workflows that define what is possible, and enforcement that happens through access, what you can click, what you can afford, what you can prove, what you can contest. A few assumptions will guide us. Assumption 1. Systems are made of people and tools, and both carry values. Even when no one intends harm, the system will reflect priorities, what is measured, what is optimized, what is ignored. No system is neutral. Every system encodes values. Assumption 2. Scarcity is always present. Time, attention, budget, trust, patience, compute, labor. Scarcity forces triage. Assumption 3. Information is incomplete and uneven. Most decision-makers see only a slice of reality. This means that rational behavior at one point in the system can be irrational for the system as a whole. Assumption 4. Incentives and constraints shape behavior more reliably than stated intentions. People do what the system rewards, and they avoid what the system punishes, especially under pressure. Now, a model limit. Speaking about the system can make it sound unified, as if it has a single purpose. That is often a useful simplification, but it is not fully true. Real systems contain competing goals, internal conflicts, and layers built at different times for different reasons. Our language will sometimes compress complexity into a single narrative, and that compression can hide important differences. Another model limit. We will describe typical patterns, not certainties. In any given case, the truth may be messier, more contingent, and less intelligible than our categories suggest. With those cautions, we can ask the core question more precisely. If governance is embedded in constraints and decision rights, then when no one appears to be in charge, we should look for the constraints that are hardest to move, the metrics that are hardest to question, and the points where responsibility evaporates. Consider a simple example. an automated queue. You submit a request, it receives a number, and it waits. No person is deciding to delay you, but the design of the queue decides the order of attention. The queue is governance. Or consider a policy that allows exceptions only through a narrow channel. The person who repeats the policy is not the governor, the policy is. Or consider a team measured by speed of resolution rather than quality of resolution. They will become fast. They may also become shallow. The metric is governance. Once we see governance this way, power becomes less theatrical and more infrastructural. The question shifts from who is the boss to what is the system optimizing and who has the ability to change that optimization. To hold this clearly, it helps to use 3 horizons. Short horizon, day-to-day execution, tickets, transactions, approvals, routine decisions. Here governance is often experienced as friction, forms, waiting, refusals, confusing handoffs. Mid-horizon, organizational adaptation, new policies, new tools, reorganizations, shifting budgets. Here governance shows up as managerial logic, performance indicators, and the politics of prioritization. Long horizon, institutional drift, norms, infrastructure, legal scaffolding, cultural expectations, and the cumulative effects of incremental optimization. Here governance becomes durable. It shapes what future choices even exist. The same system can feel ungoverned in the short horizon because no one can help you, while being heavily governed in the long horizon because the constraints are deeply set. This mismatch, felt chaos alongside deep control, is where our question lives. Power without a throne tends to arise from tensions that cannot be permanently resolved, only managed. The system is asked to be fast and safe, flexible and consistent, innovative and stable, efficient and fair. In practice, the system will pick a side, often without saying so, because incentives pick it for us. Start with the first paradox: speed versus safety. Speed is rewarded because it is visible. It reduces costs. It satisfies demand. It makes metrics look good. Safety is harder. It is the absence of failure, and its success is often invisible. Safety also adds friction, review steps, redundancies, delays, training, oversight. When nobody is clearly in charge, speed tends to win by default, especially when each node is evaluated on throughput. This produces a common local failure mode: rushed compliance. A frontline worker or a small team learns that the fastest way to survive is to meet the metric and avoid blame. They follow the script. They minimize exceptions. They avoid taking ownership for ambiguous cases. They might sincerely want to help, but the system punishes them for spending time, for escalating, for investigating, for admitting uncertainty. So the local node becomes an instrument of the metric. Then the paradox becomes broader: capability versus control. As systems become more capable, more automated, more interconnected, more responsive, they can do more, faster, with fewer humans. That capability is attractive, but control does not scale automatically. Oversight becomes more difficult because causal chains become longer and less legible. A change in one component can have effects elsewhere that nobody anticipated. The system becomes a network of dependencies, and each dependency is a place where governance can fail. Here is a systemic failure mode: accountability diffusion. When outcomes emerge from many partial decisions, an algorithmic ranking, a procurement choice, a staffing model, a default setting, no single actor can fully explain the result. Each actor can truthfully say, "I only handled my part." The outcome still harms or helps someone, but responsibility becomes unfindable. The system has power, but the power has no face. Now add the third paradox: local gain versus global stability. Local optimization is rational. A department optimizes for its budget. A team optimizes for its deadlines. A vendor optimizes for its contract. An individual optimizes for their performance review. Each local actor reduces uncertainty for themselves. Yet the sum of these optimizations can produce fragility. Buffers disappear. Redundancies are cut. Error margins shrink. The system becomes efficient and brittle. This is how governance without visible rulers becomes a governance of drift. No one decides, "Let's make the system fragile." Instead, many actors decide, "Let's remove slack. Let's standardize. Let's automate. Let's reduce variance. Let's tighten policy. Let's eliminate exceptions." Each decision is defensible. Over time, the system loses resilience. Drift has a particular signature. It feels like common sense at each step. The incentive structure makes each step look prudent, while the cumulative path becomes dangerous. Consider how hidden rule systems form. A hidden rule is not necessarily secret. It is simply not spoken as a value choice. It lives in defaults, it lives in eligibility criteria, it lives in what counts as proof, it lives in what is easy versus hard. If an appeal process exists but is time-consuming, the system quietly governs by patience and literacy. If help is available only during narrow hours, the system governs by schedule flexibility. If the interface assumes stable access to certain devices, the system governs by material conditions. If a policy requires perfect documentation, the system governs by paperwork. These are not merely operational details, they are allocations of power. In distributed decision-making, the hidden rules become more powerful than the spoken rules because they are enforced by friction rather than by decree. They shape behavior automatically. They are self-executing. We should also name the role of attention. Attention is a scarce resource in any large system. What gets attention gets fixed. What gets attention gets funded. What gets attention becomes the story of what matters. When nobody is in charge, attention becomes a proxy for governance. Yet attention is easily captured by what is immediate, measurable, and reputationally risky. Slow harms, diffuse harms, and harms that fall on the quiet or the isolated often receive less attention. This is not always malice. It is the mathematics of limited bandwidth. So we get another drift pattern. The system becomes exquisitely responsive to loud signals and slow to respond to low visibility suffering. Governance becomes a function of signal strength. Now, to stay intellectually cautious, we must explicitly address uncertainty and the limits of our models. We can often identify the incentive gradients, what is rewarded, what is punished, but we cannot fully know the internal reasoning of every participant. We can observe outcomes, but outcomes have multiple causes. We can see patterns, but patterns have exceptions. Any claim that the system wants X risks turning complex, contested dynamics into a single intention. That is a convenient story, but not always true. Still, even without claiming unified intention, we can describe a robust structural truth. When governance is not explicit, it becomes implicit. When authority is not accountable, it becomes procedural. When responsibility is unclear, it flows toward the least empowered nodes and away from the most leveraged decisions. This is one of the quiet ways power reproduces itself. In a well-functioning system, decision rights are aligned with knowledge and accountability. The people closest to the situation can exercise judgment, and the people with broad authority can be audited and corrected. In a drifting system, the opposite happens. The people closest to the situation are constrained to scripts, while the people setting constraints operate at a distance from consequences. The system is managed, but not owned. We can also see how legitimacy changes. When visible rulers disappear, legitimacy is often transferred to procedure. It's the policy, it's the process, it's how the system works. Procedure becomes a shield. It protects individuals from blame, but it can also protect the system from learning. Learning requires admitting that the rule was wrong for the context, but distributed systems often treat exceptions as threats to consistency. So they suppress exceptions. Then they lose the very information that would allow the system to adapt. Over time, the system grows a kind of procedural immune response. Anything unexpected is routed away, delayed, or denied, not because anyone chose cruelty, but because unpredictability is expensive. This is where the core question sharpens. When nobody appears to be in charge, who governs? Often the answer is, the metric governs, the default governs, the queue governs, the contract governs, the risk model governs, the compliance checklist governs, the interface governs, the boundary between departments governs. And beneath these, the deepest governor is constraint. What the system cannot afford, cannot measure, cannot explain, cannot staff, cannot legally permit, cannot reputationally survive. Constraint is a form of power, because it sets the limits of imagination. The paradox is that distributed governance can be both protective and dangerous. It can prevent arbitrary domination by a single person, and it can also prevent accountability by any person. It can distribute power, and it can distribute blame. It can create resilience through redundancy, and it can create fragility through coordination failure. Time reveals failure modes. In the short term, the system feels like a maze. In the midterm, it feels like a machine. In the long term, it can become an environment so normal that its values are no longer recognized as choices. That is power without a throne, not the drama of command, but the quiet persistence of structure. If governance is embedded in systems rather than embodied in visible rulers, the consequences unfold across horizons. Not all consequences are catastrophic. Many are subtle trade-offs. The danger is not only failure, but the slow narrowing of what is possible. Short horizon consequences: friction, displacement of judgment, and the taxation of the vulnerable. In the short horizon, people meet the system as an interface, a form, a portal, a policy statement, a phone tree, an automated decision, a waiting room. When governance is hidden, the experience is often disorientation. You cannot find the decision maker because the decision has already been made by a workflow. One consequence is the displacement of human judgment. Even where judgment exists, it is frequently pushed to the edges, exceptions, appeals, special cases. But those edges are often the hardest places to reach, so judgment becomes a privilege rather than a baseline. Another consequence is that friction becomes a sorting mechanism. This is a quiet kind of power. The system does not say you are excluded, it simply makes participation costly. The cost may be time, paperwork, waiting, repeated proof, or repeated exposure to refusal. People with spare time, stable schedules, familiarity with the process, and confidence in bureaucracy will persist. Others will drop out. The system will interpret dropout as lack of demand or lack of merit, when it may be exhaustion. This is not fear-mongering, it is a second-order effect of procedural design. When friction is used to manage load, the system governs by endurance. Short horizon also reveals a local failure mode we named earlier, rushed compliance. If the system measures throughput, the system gets throughput. The trade-off is that complexity is flattened. The cost is borne by those whose lives do not fit the template. Mid-horizon consequences: institutional self-protection, moral outsourcing, and brittleness. In the mid-horizon, organizations learn, but what they learn is shaped by what they can see and what they are punished for. A common mid-horizon consequence is institutional self-protection. When blame is costly, systems evolve to reduce blame, not to reduce harm. Documentation increases, approval layers multiply. Decisions are made in ways that are defensible rather than wise. The system becomes legible to auditors and illegible to humans. This produces what we can call moral outsourcing, not in the sense of personal virtue, but in a structural sense. People hand moral responsibility to the procedure. I followed the rules. The procedure may be necessary. It may also be inadequate. The danger is that procedures become a substitute for reflection. Another mid-horizon consequence is brittleness from optimization. Efficiency removes slack. Standardization reduces variance. Automation reduces labor. Each can be beneficial, but together they often remove the buffers that allow graceful failure. When something unexpected happens, the system has fewer places to absorb shock. Brittleness is a tail risk amplifier. The system may run smoothly for long periods, then fail sharply when a rare condition appears, because resilience was optimized away. Tail risks are hard to quantify. Our models underestimate rare events, especially when they depend on complex interdependencies, so we should not pretend to know exactly when or how brittleness will manifest. But the direction of the risk is understandable. Tighter coupling and reduced slack reduce tolerance for surprise. Mid-horizon also introduces the systemic failure mode of accountability diffusion. When many hands touch a process, each hand is a plausible deniability point. Over time, this can corrode legitimacy. People stop believing that outcomes are contestable. They stop believing that anyone can hear them. The cost is not only dissatisfaction, it is the weakening of feedback. Feedback is governance. When feedback weakens, systems become more self-referential. They judge themselves by their own metrics, not by lived outcomes. Long-horizon consequences, value lock-in, attention capture, and the narrowing of civic imagination. In the long horizon, governance becomes environment. The rules become so familiar that they feel like physics. One long-horizon consequence is value lock-in. Early design choices, how identity is verified, what counts as eligibility, what is measurable, what is prioritized, harden into infrastructure. Changing them becomes expensive. People build their lives around them. Organizations build their budgets around them. The system becomes difficult to reform, not because no one wants change, but because the dependency network is vast. Value lock-in is not inherently bad. Stability can protect people from arbitrariness. The trade-off is that locked-in values may not match changing realities. When reality changes, locked-in systems respond by forcing reality into old categories. Another long-horizon consequence is attention capture at scale. Systems learn to optimize for what is rewarded, and what is rewarded often correlates with attention, engagement, visibility, immediate performance. Over time, this can reshape what a society notices, what it debates, and what it neglects. Attention shapes behavior, identity, and outcome. When governance is implicit, attention becomes the unofficial legislature. A third long-horizon consequence is the narrowing of civic imagination, the set of options people believe are possible. If the system repeatedly signals that exceptions are impossible, that appeals are futile, that outcomes are automated and final, people internalize those constraints. They stop asking certain questions. They stop offering certain kinds of input. Governance becomes quieter, not because it is better, but because fewer people believe they can influence it. This is not a claim that the future is fixed. It is a claim about inertia. Systems accumulate mass. Mass creates momentum. Across all horizons, a consistent trade-off appears. Distributed governance can reduce the risk of arbitrary domination by a single ruler, but it can increase the risk of unaccountable domination by structure. If a single person rules, you know where to appeal, where to protest, where to negotiate. If structure rules, the appeal path may not exist, or may exist only as a symbolic ritual. That is why people experience a strange emotional contradiction. They can feel both oppressed and ignored, oppressed by constraints, ignored by the absence of a responsible agent. We should also acknowledge a countervailing consequence. Distributed governance can be resilient when designed with redundancy, checks, and plural feedback channels. Diversity of decision points can prevent single-point capture. It can allow experimentation. It can create stability through decentralization. But that when-designed clause matters. Distributed systems do not automatically become wise. They become whatever their incentives and constraints make stable. Under pressure, they tend to become what is easiest to manage, not what is most meaningful. And here, we must keep humility. We are describing tendencies, not declarations of fate or future certainty. Not certainties. Uncertainty is not permission for neglect, but it is a reminder that governance must be robust to error, because every system we build will misunderstand something. The question is whether it can learn without breaking people in the process. So the consequences of hidden governance are not only outcomes, they are path dependencies. They determine what kinds of corrections are possible later. They determine whether errors can be admitted. They determine whether the system can be wrong safely. This is why power without a throne matters. It is power that rarely announces itself, rarely takes responsibility, and rarely pauses for reflection, unless the system contains mechanisms that make reflection unavoidable. We have circled a difficult insight. When nobody appears to be in charge, governance has not vanished. It has relocated into constraint, procedure, and design. The system governs through what it makes easy and what it makes exhausting. It is tempting at this point to seek a single culprit. That temptation is understandable because clarity is comforting. If one actor is responsible, then one actor can be replaced. But distributed governance rarely grants that simplicity. The causes are layered, the incentives are shared, the outcomes are emergent. A disciplined stance, then, is not to abandon judgment, but to refine it. We can hold two truths at once. First, many individuals inside a system are sincere, capable, and constrained. They may not be the authors of the rules they enforce. Second, sincerity does not neutralize outcomes. Harm can be produced by well-intentioned optimization. Exclusion can be produced by neutral-seeming procedures. Neglect can be produced by limited attention. This is where humility becomes practical, rather than decorative. We must admit model limits. We do not fully know how any large system will behave under stress, because stress reveals interactions that were previously dormant. We also do not fully know what future conditions will demand of today's infrastructures. Our predictions are partial. But uncertainty does not erase responsibility. It changes the form of responsibility from certainty to robustness. Robustness is the capacity to remain functional when assumptions fail. Resilience is the capacity to recover when failures occur. Governance under uncertainty is not primarily about perfection. It is about error tolerance, recoverability, and the preservation of human dignity when the model is wrong. So if we return to the core question, who governs when nobody appears to be in charge? One answer is, the system's constraints govern. Another answer is, the system's incentives govern. Another answer is, the system's defaults govern. Yet there is also a quieter answer. The system's blind spots govern. What cannot be seen cannot be corrected. What cannot be measured cannot compete in budget meetings. What cannot be named cannot be defended. In that sense, the absence of a ruler can become the presence of a shadow constitution, an unwritten set of priorities encoded in technical and procedural detail. The question, then, is not only who governs, but what kind of governor is a procedure. A procedure is consistent, but consistency is not the same as justice. A procedure is scalable, but scalability is not the same as wisdom. A procedure reduces discretion, but reduced discretion is not the same as reduced harm. We can also ask, what kind of governor is a metric? A metric is crisp, but crispness is not the same as truth. A metric can align behavior, but alignment is not the same as legitimacy. A metric can accelerate performance, but acceleration is not the same as safety. And we can ask, what kind of governor is automation? Automation can remove bias in some places and amplify it in others. It can standardize service and standardize exclusion. It can reduce human error and reduce human appeal. It can scale capability and scale mistakes. If there is any clarity to offer without closure, it is this: governance is part of the system, not an ornament added later. Where governance is not explicit, it will be implicit. Where accountability is not designed, it will be absent. Where feedback is not protected, it will be silenced by friction. Still, we should resist the desire to end with a formula. There will always be trade-offs. Speed will press against safety. Capability will press against control. Local gain will press against global stability. These tensions cannot be solved once and for all. They can only be governed, revisited, renegotiated, and made legible. And legibility is itself a form of power. When people can see how decisions are made, they can contest them. When they cannot see, they can only endure. So we sit, briefly, with an unfinished thought. Perhaps the most consequential rulers are the ones we stop noticing, the defaults that become normal, the constraints that become invisible, the procedures that become unquestionable. This is not a call to action, and it is not a condemnation. It is an invitation to a steadier perception, to look for governance not only in leaders, but in the quiet machinery of decisions, not only in orders, but in options, not only in rules, but in what the rules make impossible. In the end, power without a throne is not less powerful. It is simply harder to name, and what is hard to name is hard to govern. Hold the horizons. What rules today may govern tomorrow.